Good morning, everyone. Welcome of you joining the public presentation organized by the Occupational Health Center. So we are so pleased to have Michelle Mialkowski. She's the prevention consultant from the state of Manitoba to doing a great topic presentation for us beyond ergonomics, integrating psychological safety into musculoskeletal injuries prevention. So this is one of the activity we recognize the Repetitive Strain Injury Awareness Day. So today this is the webinar, from 9:30 to 10:30. We are going to have an in-person event coming up on Thursday, the 26th from 9 a.m. to 12 noon at Northwood Community Center. So the event is about empowering your health and safety committees to prevent and control musculoskeletal injuries. That will be at the Northwood Community Health Center. So we still have space for registration. I'm going to put the registration link on the chat too as well. So before we have Michelle to doing her presentation, I just want to reading her bio. Michelle is host a Bachelor of Exercise and Sport Science in Athletic Therapy and a Master in Exercise Science. She has been a certified athletic therapist for over 20 years and received her certified ergonomics specialist designation in 2019. Her passion for injury prevention began early while working with competitive and recreational athletes at the local, provincial, national, and collegiate level. In 2016, she started working as an injury prevention specialist in healthcare, training healthcare workers on protecting themselves from injuries and providing ergonomics consult for injury prevention. Since 2022, she has been a prevention consultant with Safe Work Manitoba, the WCB division dedicated to preventing workplace injury and illnesses. So now please join me to welcome Michelle.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I'm really happy you're signed up. So today we're going to talk about MSI prevention and psychological safety. Before we keep going, the Workers' Compensation Board of Manitoba respectfully acknowledges that we are on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Innuak, Cree, Asininu, Dakota, Dene, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our services extend across treaties 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We recognize the significance of the land where we live and work, and we're grateful for the resources it provides. We are committed to reconciliation as we acknowledge the past and move forward in a spirit of continuous learning. We honor, respect, and strive to cultivate partnerships with Indigenous communities while acknowledging that this is a journey of awareness and understanding. So the information in the presentation today is intended for general use and may not apply in every circumstance. It is not a definitive guide to government regulations and does not release the viewers from the responsibilities under applicable legislation. Safe Work Manitoba has tried to present the most up-to-date information, but does not guarantee the accuracy of, nor assume liability for, the information presented here. Viewers should seek their own legal and health advice, or follow safe work procedures. So for today, I'm briefly going to just zoom through the recognized MSI hazards in the province of Manitoba. I'm going to talk about how psychosocial hazards can lead to MSI. Then I'm going to highlight about 4 psychosocial factors I think maybe drive MSIs a little more than the rest. And then I have some suggestions for control at the end of today. So an MSI is a soft tissue damage or aggravation to the musculoskeletal system. They can happen suddenly, which would be considered an acute injury, or they can happen over time, which is a cumulative or a chronic injury. So your sudden injury can be bending down to pick something up off the floor, and then you have that shooting pain in your back. And over time, a very common one most people are familiar with is something like a carpal tunnel that builds up over time. So regardless of whether it happens suddenly or it takes a while to happen, there's a formula to remember how MSIs occur. And the concept is that the workload your body is exposed to is greater than the tolerance of your body's tissues. So workload greater than tissue tolerance results in an injury. So there's both signs and symptoms of an MSI. Any kind of signs of an MSI would be swelling, redness or discoloration, and then also just a decreased range of motion for what you normally have for your body. When it comes to symptoms, these are things you can feel. So you have pain or inking. Typically, if you get any kind of numbness, tingling, shooting, or burning, that would be an indication that your nerves may also be affected along with the tendons, ligaments, or muscles. So with the hazards that I'm going to talk through, typically none of the hazards actually act in isolation. You might see one that might look more obvious than another hazard, but usually no MSI hazard is just there by itself. Usually it combines with another one. So the first recognized MSI hazard are awkward or sustained postures. So it's any non-neutral posture that increases stress on muscles, tendons, ligaments, or other parts of the body. Your neutral posture is if you're standing up straight, head in neutral, and your palms are actually down by your side and turned out. So a forceful exertion, it's any action that has the potential to overload the body. In the picture I have here of a worker adding salt to a soft water tank, there's actually two kinds of forceful exertion. One, carrying the big 50-pound bag of salt, but close to his body, but then also the grip he needs to have on his top hand, that would also be a forceful exertion around his hand as well. Repetitive motion, it's a continually performing the same movement without any variation. Hard or sharp surfaces pressing the body. So one of the main rules anyone in MSI prevention always talks about is you should never use your hand or your knee as a hammer. And then kind of a more common office example on the right is you can see where the woman is typing and their wrist is just actually against the corner of the table, and it'll cause a bit of a compression, impair blood flow right to where the skin is being pressed down, and that can lead to an injury or aggravation. And then vibration, it occurs when a tool or heavy machine shakes repetitively and these forces are transferred to the body. So I think typically with vibration, people consider like handheld tools like in the picture here, but you can experience whole body vibration from riding around on heavy equipment or driving a truck for a long distance, and the vibration you're exposed to can impair your body and can cause some issues. For limitation on motion, so the concept here is you're sort of forced into some sort of awkward posture. And in this picture here, we have it's because of the hood system that's being used for the worker to help protect them from inhaling anything. But because they have to slip their arms up and under the protective shield, it actually will force them to sort of limit how much they can move their arms, where they can put it, how close they can keep their limbs to their body because of the physical workplace design. So I just have a quick poll for everyone to try out. For 2025, what percent of all accepted MSI claims had time loss tied to the claim? So if you can just pick an answer. And then Tiffany, if you can just jump in and say when we're going to close the poll, or I can click to the next slide, you'll let me know.
I could close it when this is reached to 80%.
Perfect.
Michelle, this is the result from the poll.
Okay, so we got 63% as the biggest answer. So here is the answer for everyone. Hang on. I'm gonna, oh, there we go. Okay, So actually, MSI time loss claims are 59% of all submitted MSI claims in 2025. But what I put here for this number is basically 1 in 3 of claims submitted to WCB in 2025 were an MSI time loss claim. But if we just did the math of there were this many time loss claims this many MSI claims, this many were time loss, it worked out to 59% of all submitted MSI claims. But overall, 1 out of every 3 claims submitted to WCB end up being a time loss claim that's MSI. So this is just one more reason why it's really important to make sure that we're doing what we can to prevent MSIs. Oh, hang on. I don't want an arrow. Huh. Okay, so we have the 6 recognized MSI hazards in the Manitoba Workplace Safety and Health Act and Regulations. MSI hazards, again, do not act in isolation. MSI prevention can result in overall lost time lost days and claims and WCB costs for employers. Okay, so how do psychosocial hazards lead to MSI? So I have this picture here. It's actually from my phys ed and kinesiology days. But the example I like to give people is, who here has ever done a workout where they haven't done one for a while, and then like the next couple days after, like the stairs and having to sit down to go use the restroom are both like a challenging workout all on their own. So what happens is you have some sort of baseline that you're normally at, and then you do that workout. And what happens is you actually feel a little bit worse than your baseline. But if you recover from that, and you're allowed to recover, you can actually bring up your baseline to a new baseline to be able to resist the next workout. The issue is that if you're exposed to stress all the time and you don't get any kind of rest, then you start to get into this exhaustion phase. So even though I was talking about like physical activity, this is also how people respond to stress at work. So you can have good stress or bad stress. It's really determined by how long it lasts, your perception and your control over the situation, and the impact it has. And again, along with the outcome, do you get some recovery in between, or is it just continually going? So to define a psychosocial hazard, it's defined as anything that arises from or relates to the aspect of work organization or the way the work is structured, the social factors at work or the workplace interactions, the work environment, including equipment and hazardous tasks, or could reasonably be expected to present a risk to psychological safety of a worker over a prolonged period that is excessive or unusual in intensity. So what's the difference between stress and a hazard? So psychosocial hazards are the risk the organization can ignore. The hazards are the causes that increase the risk of harm, while stress is the response of each individual worker to the hazards that are there. So the hazards are considered a systemic thing, and the stress is individual. So the other thing that kind of makes it an issue when trying to address psychological safety in the workplace, this adds another layer of opaqueness, because how I might react to a new deadline that's been set at work could be entirely different than how my coworker reacts to the exact same deadline they have to hit as well. So that can be where employers may struggle for how to address hazards, because people actually react differently to them. So psychosocial hazards are real. It refers to the internal and individual mental processes, while the psychological refers to the internal processes and responses to the hazards. And the psychosocial aspect encompasses both the psychological aspects of the environment as well. So it's just important that what happens is when you're going around looking for hazards, you add a psychosocial lens to your current workplace safety and health program. So there are multipliers of MSI hazards. So again, just like I talked about with the stress, our work organization, the duration and frequency of the tasks can make for hazards to be more amplified. How the workplace is laid out. One of the biggest examples I always talk about is there was a study referenced I feel like this is about 15 years ago now, but they found that in healthcare, if workers had to walk farther than 10 meters to get safety equipment, they would just skip getting it because they didn't want to walk the 10 meters to the safety equipment and back. So for most people, 10 meters would be anywhere from like 8 to 15 strides one direction, if we're looking at stride length. So again, multipliers of MSI hazards too are tools and are objects that we have, how people have to hold them, how they're designed, who they're designed for. If you're working in really hot or really cold temperatures, that can actually fatigue the body quicker. And then the biggest one we're focusing on today are the psychological and cognitive demands. So any kind of time pressures in the pace of the work, and when hazards are overlooked, MSIs start to escalate. So stress hormones, the big one we always hear about is cortisol. It increases blood pressure, the risk of anxiety, increased levels of cortisol suppress your immune system. With the muscle tension, you start to feel just pain, tight, loss of range of motion. Secondary health issues can also come up, so like headaches, migraines. Lots of times too, with the reduced recovery, people aren't relaxing as well. So what's happening at work comes home with them. So it affects even their work-life balance. Just coming home feeling more stressed will also impact your musculoskeletal system's ability to actually relax and recover in between more physically demanding shifts. So behavior-wise, what typically happens when we're seeing an increased amount of stress or demands in the workplace, workers will often skip breaks or ignore pain signals. So typically what will happen is like people will actually just be putting themselves in more awkward postures or trying to shortcut just to get things done or meet deadlines or meet a certain count. So it's important that people are following the safe work procedures they've been taught. So with an increased pain responses, things might feel a lot more sore. So the example would be is if you were, say, let's pretend our Team Canada actually won yesterday. You found $20 in your jacket pocket later. You have a vacation coming up. So all these things are really good. So then if you even get something like a paper cut, you're like, whatever, it doesn't matter. My team's winning. I got $20, vacation's coming right away. But conversely, our team lost yesterday. The temperature just plummeted. You had a slip and fall, and suddenly it feels like you've just busted every bone in your body. The way you feel and respond to pain is directly impacted by like how you're actually doing psychologically as well. So it's really important that you do give your body the opportunity to rest and recover and don't let that stress build up. Another thing that can happen too is your sleep is going to be highly affected by any kind of stress that you're experiencing. It'll be harder to actually fall asleep and get deeper sleep. And again, there's definitely going to be a higher likelihood of near misses and incidents. So again, when we're looking at musculoskeletal injury prevention, I hope everyone can kind of take away the fact that it is very multifaceted. So the psychosocial hazards are the systemic things at the organizational level. They can help facilitate MSI hazards and accentuate them. The stress, though, is the individual response to the hazards in the workplace. So the next aspect we're talking about is psychosocial factors. So these are the 13 psychosocial factors that exist in the workplace as identified by the CSA standard. So the first one that I wanted to kind of talk about that I believe has an influence over MSIs is workload management. So when workload management is actually done right, it's a proactive work design and planning. So there's realistic expectations, there's proactive scheduling and flexibility in people's days. Workers feel like they have a higher amount of control and involvement over what they're doing. They have input into the workflow itself. There's clear communication and role clarity with defined roles. And there's a supportive, collaborative culture that's highlighted with team cooperation. Now, when it's managed poorly, this is when we see people starting to skip their breaks. There's increased amount of overtime. Any kind of asking for help may be actually viewed as a bit of a weakness. The team feels like it's constantly in a crisis mode, like it feels like a never-ending game of whack-a-mole where you're not really getting a break and you just feel like you're always putting out fires. Sometimes too, workers might be given a new task without sufficient training to be able to do it, and they just have to figure it out, which that kind of level of opaqueness can make people feel that they're not even sure what they're doing, especially if they don't understand employer objectives. So again, this can be where people will maybe make mistakes. They may overlook things just because they're trying to pay attention to so many things at once. You're going to see a lot of burnout, emotional distress. Physically, people would start presenting with higher blood pressure, heart disease, chronic fatigue, headaches, muscle tightness. So if workload can't be managed properly, you're going to have inadequate recovery time. People are constantly trying to put out fires. They're constantly trying to meet a new deadline, and it never feels like they're getting any kind of break or rest from just a tsunami of work. So usually what'll happen too is just to get things done, like from an office example, if you're just somewhere where you have to constantly be doing things, you won't get up and move from your computer and you'll be sitting all like hunched over your desk the whole time. And then finally 3 hours later, you go to move and everything is just sore and stiff from being in that static posture for so long. So again, too, like you're going to see like workers might end up getting that spillover into their work-life balance. So they might start actually taking some of that stress, anger, tiredness home with them if they don't have the ability to recover and actually have a break from changes and high intensity deadlines. So another factor that I wanted to highlight for everybody here today was involvement and influence. So this is a work environment, again, where there's a lot of open communication and active participation. Workers feel like they have meaningful input into their work processes. One of the biggest things, I think, no matter where people have worked, it's a common experience for everyone, but have you worked somewhere where you show up one Monday and all of a sudden there's a new tool or new operation and you're just told, we're using this tool from now on. And then you try using it and you see all these glitches and how even though this tool is designed allegedly for the task you have to do, when you try doing it in practice, there's some things that there's gaps and there's things that are missed and you have to do a lot of corrections for them because it wasn't addressed when this new process or technology or tool was put in place. So that's why it's super important that when any employer is actually considering putting in any kind of changes or changes to process, tools, technology, they do consult the workforce, find out from the frontline workers, what do you actually do? What do you need to do? What's the hardest thing you have to do? And how can we make it easier? Asking those kinds of questions and giving workers that kind of involvement will make your change management processes a lot easier. So what happens is when involvement and influence isn't managed well, workers will feel like, well, what's the point of me complaining? No one will listen to me anyways. And when people feel like that level of disengagement, people aren't engaged not only in maybe doing the work, but they won't be engaged in safety. So there'll be a drop in safety culture. There'll be a drop in just workplace attitudes and engagement in the workplace. You'll end up seeing a high amount of turnover in the workplace. And again, when you look at having to like onboard new people, it's a huge cost to employers and also even for workers, because if they're constantly training a new person, it does make doing your own work a lot harder if you have to have somebody shadowing you and watching you do it and learning the process as you go, because you have to slow it down, and the steps that feel intuitive to you, you're talking them all out and showing them. And the worker that you're training might even be asking, well, why am I doing it that way? So again, you want to make sure that involvement and influence are being addressed. So when involvement and influence are not addressed appropriately, there's increased physiological stress. So people are going to have those higher levels of cortisol, blood pressure is going to go up, they're going to have more muscle tension, muscle pain, muscle headaches. MSI hazards will be ignored because there's no time to address them. Usually what will happen too, even is when it comes to incident investigations, the investigation will just be some version of Michelle needs to slow down and pay more attention without looking at what the system is actually doing to maybe actually lead to my MSI to begin with. So without involving workers in the workplace structure and what's going on, there'll be a direct link to increased incidence and time loss. So, and that'll just come from like higher rates of mistakes because people are just in such a hurry to finish and get to the next thing. They might not be paying attention in the moment because they're thinking of 3 other tasks they have to get done before the end of the day. So another factor that I want to address today is psychological support. A work environment where coworkers and supervisors are supportive of employee psychological safety. So the systemic risk management is really evident when there's a really high level of psychological support in the workplace. The employer is controlling risks before they even cause any harm. There's a supportive and inclusive culture with empathetic leadership, usually a lot of coaching involved. There's effective work design and control. When these are managed appropriately, it leads to a healthier and more resilient workforce. So when it's not managed properly, you're going to see a lot more absenteeism and presenteeism in the workplace. Employees will be taking more sick leave. They'll show up to work while sick or distressed, resulting in lower productivity. There'll be a withdrawal and disengagement as well if there's low psychological support. There might even be a fear to actually speak up if there's a safety concern when there is lower psychological support. Typically, you'll see more of like a chaotic urgency or a profit at all costs attitude if psychological support is not managed well. So again, typically with a poor psychological support, you're going to sort of feel like you're in a chronic fight or flight sort of status where you're sort of always on the go. We're going to get that increased muscle tension, reduced recovery time, and that higher pain sensitivity I referred to. That lack of support causes chronic stress, which directly harms the musculoskeletal system. With increased muscle tension, the unresolved stress keeps muscles taut, particularly in the shoulders and neck, leading to pain and eventually injuries. With the reduced recovery and repair, stress hormones like cortisol combined with fatigue hinder the body's ability to repair tissues, making workers more susceptible to strain. What will happen too is workers might start actually using more force for the tasks they have to do. So frustrated and stressed employees may actually just grip onto tools tighter, hold the phone tighter when they're answering the phone, leading to fatigue and strain. Again, too, this will be another situation where people might feel like they have to skip breaks or work past their scheduled shift to get work finished. So it's really important that psychological support is addressed to prevent MSI. So clear leadership and expectation. So if you have clear leadership and clear job expectations, everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. There's very clear role clarity when it comes to what I need to do, what I have to accomplish today, what I have to accomplish by the end of the week, and what I have to accomplish by the end of the month. So workers regularly get constructive feedback on what they're doing. There's a very supportive leadership style with the employer, and there's fair and consistent decision making. So when decisions are made, nobody is ever thinking like, well, why the H did they choose that? What's going on? Why are we switching to this now? There's nobody questioning what's actually happening. Things actually feel like they make sense. So when leadership and expectations go poorly managed, again, we see that higher amount of employee turnover and absenteeisms. Employees will just leave. frequently take time off due to frustration and stress. Usually there's some sort of invisible leadership. Managers sometimes will avoid difficult conversations, or I've seen situations with employers where there's one manager supervisor for up to about 200 workers. So managers don't get time in their schedule to actually have conversations with their workers unless it's from a performance management perspective. And workers really need conversation and engagement with leadership beyond just, you're kind of sucking today, Michelle, you need to do better. So it's really important that leaders have the opportunity to talk and engage with workers on more than just a performance management basis. So lots of times too, if there's a lack of clear leadership, you're going to see a huge, it's not my job mentality. If people are, whether it's other like customers coming to the business or other coworkers from other departments, if there isn't clear leadership and expectations, people will not want to do any more than what they think is expected of them. No one's ever going to rise beyond that. You'll also see a lot of silos where there's unclear leadership and expectations. There's a chance that there's some departments where even within a department, some people won't know what other people are working on. And then especially at a higher level, there's departments that won't know what other departments are working on or how they function. So psychologically and emotionally, this would have a huge impact on workers because, again, if they feel like there's no purpose or meaning to what they're doing, it's not really clear to them, then why should they even put in an effort? So you'll see like a less than 100% effort. You'll see that presenteeism where people will have their butts in their seats, but how productive are they really being? And there'll be a huge, huge, huge erosion in trust. And trust is one of those things where once it's broken, it can maybe be brought back a little bit, but it's always going to be damaged. It'll never be what it was before once that trust is broken between workers and an employer. So again, these high stress environments will present with a high physical strain. So people will either have more muscle tension, they're going to get increased MSI rates. The burnout and fatigue will lead to distractions that can make people maybe miss a cord and trip over it. They may be reaching for something and then bang their head on the way up because they're trying to do it so quickly. And again, too, when you're in a situation where there is a lack of role clarity or you're not really sure what leadership wants from you, there is going to be a disregard for the overall safety culture in the workplace as well. And again, you're going to see very poor communication, like typically in environments where leaders are only talking to workers from a performance management perspective. There's not a lot of communication on what the employer is doing or how they're doing it. And that poor communication will also lead to unreported hazards. So if there's hazards that go unreported, it can make more people susceptible to the injury. And the other thing too is even if someone does sustain an injury like an MSI, what kind of communication goes out after that MSI if the entire investigation just led to Michelle should slow down and pay more attention? There's going to be this assumption no one else will be affected by the hazard and it may very well go unaddressed. So that's why we want to make sure that people understand what they need to be doing, what the safe work procedures are, and why they need to be following those safe work procedures. So again, just like when I mentioned in the MSI hazards, how none of those body postures or hazards act in isolation, like typically you might be having to reach and pull really hard, generating a forceful exertion while your arm is out in an awkward posture, right? You may be having to hold some sort of device that is vibrating in your hand, but you're also having to squeeze it a little bit to keep it in place. So you never have an MSI hazard really acting on its own. The same thing too with psychosocial factors. They all just overlap like a big Venn diagram. But the frequency and severity of MSIs will increase when psychosocial hazards remain unaddressed. So I have one more little quiz for everybody to answer. So the question is, of the 4 factors I very briefly and quickly talked about, what one do you think would be more challenging to manage and address within your workplace? So you can choose workload management, involvement and influence, psychological support, clear leadership and expectations, or you can just say you don't want to answer or don't know. So everyone just choose one because I just want to see what you think. Oh, Tiffany, did you get the answers for it? There we go. Okay, so I kind of have the same feeling too. I personally think both the workload management and psychological support would be the harder ones to really kind of address and tackle, because those would just, they take a lot of time. Like, even if you recognize something like workload management is an issue for your workplace, just because you've identified it as a hazard doesn't mean next week it's suddenly going to get better. It'll take months in order to really improve with some very serious effort. So my next question is, which factors do you believe would be easier to manage or address within your workplace? So same thing again, choose some answers here. Okay, yes, clear leadership and expectations, it's a huge factor, but really making sure that you have appropriate communication going out to the team, everybody is getting the same message and the rules seem to be applied the same way and everyone understands what's expected of them, can have a huge impact, and it probably would be one of the easier ones overall to manage. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit for controlling hazards. I'm going to briefly touch on the internal responsibility system. So it's a safety management system where when we're looking at it, the CEO has the most responsibility and they also have the most accountability within the criminal code. So basically, responsibility and authority for health and safety must be delegated to the workers because they're the ones that are actually doing it. However, if a worker sees there's a safety issue, they should feel empowered to actually speak up and bring it up the chain to get addressed. So at the same time, everyone above the worker is actually who's responsible to make sure that the health and safety system is actually operating the way it's supposed to. So it's really important that workers are actually getting that connection with their leaders. Workers or their supervisors are actually coming out, watching them work and make sure they're following what their training is. I think one way that leads to more MSIs sometimes is workers will go for training on a safe work procedure, but then when they get back into the actual workplace at their workstation, they may hear, well, just because Michelle showed you to do that in training, we actually just do it this way here because it's faster. Right? So is there this disconnect between training and actual performance? And can workers actually speak up and say, hey, there's an issue with this safe work procedure or not? So I like the internal responsibility system because instead of it just being this catch-all phrase of everyone's responsible for safety, it clearly outlines the steps and where the accountability actually lies to make sure the health and safety program is being followed, but also the responsibility for the safety program are the workers that are actually doing it. So we have a hierarchy of controls. Basically, the most effective way to make sure people don't get hurt at work is to just eliminate the hazard to begin with. However, lots of times when it comes to MSIs, because it's a worker having to do a task, we're usually more often at this worker level. I'm going to see if I can move. Oh, okay, so the worker level, this is where we can reduce our exposure. We usually have like our safe work procedures here, but sometimes along the way, we can actually look at engineering some options. So whether it's maybe adding in a machine to do part of the work through some engineering, that can actually help. Also, maybe we can get equipment that can change heights at least, so that way it can accommodate to the worker that's at the station. And then again, when we come to the worker level, this is when we're looking at developing safe work procedures that workers can follow to prevent injuries. But again, once you get down to this level 3, it's usually like the least effective or least reliable for preventing MSIs, and it's the lowest level of safety protection. So there's that trade-off, but ultimately for a lot of MSI prevention, you're really relying on this with maybe a little bit of that. Okay, so Tiffany, do you mind putting in the sample control sheet into the chat for everybody? So Safe Work Manitoba, I have a link to our website in about another 15 slides or so, but this is just for everyone to just have access to right now, but it lists all the psychosocial factors that exist and then possible controls that can be done for each one. What I'm going to highlight controls for the factors that I highlighted in section 3. So for workload management, we've identified that workers are skipping their breaks and our overtime hours have increased in the last 18 months. So the risks that we've identified are there's increased fatigue due to less recovery time and increased risk for MSI because workers are tired and rushing. So the controls we're looking at is maybe adding in some job rotation, trying to actually get the schedule set a little bit better, including actually, we're going to develop as an employer a dispute resolution process for workload issues. So the benefits of job rotation. So studies have identified there can be benefits to job rotation, but technically adding in job rotation doesn't change the severity of the risk for MSI when you're rotating the jobs. What it does is it changes the duration of the exposure for the workers. So instead of maybe a worker being all day at one station, if they're only there for 2 hours, they're still at the same level of risk for MSI, but the duration of time that they're going to be there is a little bit less. So that's where job rotation can come in to help change what people are doing. Their exposure to the physical demands at one station will be reduced. It reduces the physiological stress, the nervous system effects. Hopefully it can reduce employee exposure to the higher risk jobs that are there. Typically too, if you're looking at changing the pacing or scheduling, what can happen there is you might get increased work process proficiency, increased innovation, because if the employees actually see the employer wants to make changes and the workers feel like they might be involved in how their workload is being delegated, they might actually have a good solution for that. So one of the things I've tucked in here is if you're a committee member and you're going around doing quarterly inspections, because psychosocial hazards, again, they're invisible, like there's nothing to see the same way you would if like a light was burnt out or a cord was across a path or something like that. Like it's not something you can actually see. So the same way you would go around on your quarterly inspection asking workers if they know where the first aid kit is or what to do during a fire drill, you can ask workers, do you feel you have the time and resources to complete tasks safely and efficiently? In the last 3 months, how frequently have you worked beyond your scheduled hours to keep up with your workload? And do you feel your workload is manageable? One of the things I'd probably add in for these kind of questions you're wanting to address, I would challenge committees to maybe pick a psychosocial factor they want to look at for the next quarter or next 2 quarters. And then pick some questions you want to ask that could address that factor and ask it around at workers. And then the next time you go around, see if you get some changes in answers and see what the committee's done kind of over a couple quarters versus maybe trying to ask about 20 different questions addressing like 8 or 9 different factors, because it'd be a lot harder to really see any kind of impact or change to that. So for involvement and influence, the hazards we identified was a lot of workers feel apathetic towards their work and they don't feel like they have a lot of input or control over what they're doing. So the risks that have been identified are workers aren't speaking up about safety issues. there's a decreased safety culture and an increased risk of MSI. So for the controls, the employer is going to give committee members input into the policies, procedures, and procurement of anything that's happening with the employer. So the committee gets to review a policy that's now been done by HR, whether it's a new policy or a revised one. And the committee can give some input onto how it's written to ask for clarification under maybe like a policy usually delegates roles and responsibilities. So maybe the committee will see something that someone in HR doesn't see, and they can add that in. And then they're also going to add some worker consultations into the functions. So for involvement and influence, you can ask workers, like, have you participated in any safety meetings or training in the last 3 months? Do safety meetings provide you the opportunity to raise safety concerns? So sometimes there may be a safety huddle, but it might just be, so HR wanted me to bring to your attention that you need to, and then it just rattles off something. So that's not very engaging. It's not very helpful or proactive. So do workers feel like they have the opportunity at any kind of safety meeting or team meeting to bring up and raise concerns? And do they feel like those concerns will be addressed? Have you or your team been involved in reviewing any safe work procedures in the last 3 months? Is there one safe work procedure you think needs reviewing? When you identify a new hazard, what is your first step to report it? So again, do workers actually know what to do if there's actually a safety concern? Can they address it and feel like something's going to happen with it? So for psychological support, the hazards there's a lack of support from supervisors to workers and a lack of information or training on workplace functions and processes. So our risks there are low morale, apathy, diminished interest, low self-esteem, frustration, fear, and distrust. So this one is a big one because, again, because I spent a lot of time in healthcare, I think even before I went into MSI prevention in healthcare, I had other roles within healthcare. And I think 20, 30 years ago, there was this reputation of, well, Michelle's been a healthcare employee for X amount of years. Therefore, that qualifies Michelle to be a manager now in healthcare. Even though I've never took any kind of manager training, managing a team is entirely different than working on a floor. Having that floor experience can benefit me a little bit, but managers still need training on how to manage, talk to workers, have difficult conversations. So having some sort of training for supervisors on how they speak to their workers would have a huge impact on making workers feel like it's safe to go talk to my manager if I have a concern. I feel like my manager will actively take a role in addressing it. The other thing we want to do is train on near-miss reporting. So maybe if we're addressing psychological support in the workplace, have a blitz on, like, is there a safety issue? Are you concerned about something? Please report it. Here's our new system to report it, and blitz it out and make sure workers are well aware of it, and see if you can actually get more people engaged in actually speaking up about safety issues that exist. Another thing too would be getting trauma-informed workplace training that can have a huge impact on interpersonal relationships. So questions if you wanted to address psychological support in the workplace, if you're going around doing quarterly inspections, would be, are you aware of support resources available through the workplace? So there could be EAP or peer counseling. Do you feel comfortable seeking help for psychological safety concerns without fear of stigma? And if you're actually going around talking to any leaders, are you trained to recognize and be supportive of workers' psychological safety concerns? So the last factor I want to address is controls for leadership and expectations. So our psychosocial hazard, we identified there's conflicting and unclear reporting lines, a lack of clarity about work priorities, and then another big one is work expectations that undermine one another. So has anyone ever worked somewhere where they need to give awesome customer service, but also you're not allowed to spend longer than 2 minutes talking to a customer? So if you have something like that going on, how do you actually do really awesome customer service if you know there's a clock counting down that you have to end that call in 2 minutes or less? So are there any kind of conflicting demands like that? What happens too is if those are the hazards that are there, you're going to see burnout, an increased risk of mistakes, and an increased risk of MSI. So the controls we're looking at are regular communication between leadership and workers. So it's not just performance management based. Leadership should be engaged with workers beyond when they're actually in trouble, right? So it's really important that workers feel like their managers want to talk to them more than just when there's an issue. And there's consistent feedback given for the supervision of workers. So if committees were going around to ask questions in regards to this factor, what I came up with was, do you come to work knowing what is expected of you? When a work processes change, are workers given clear expectations and are supported throughout the transition? And do workers receive regular and constructive feedback that supports their growth? So, wrapping up, we'll have some time for some questions, but effective MSI prevention has to consider psychosocial hazards, recognize the strong links between worker well-being, work design, and physical injury risk. It requires employers to address both physical and psychosocial hazards. So on this page here, the QR code links to the Safe Work Manitoba Psychological Health and Safety Resources. But here's a list of other resources you can check out if you're interested in other psychological health and safety resources. I'm going to go to the next page just quickly. This is my contact information if you wanted to reach out to me and ask any questions, if you wanted any kind of clarity. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I did send Tiffany a PDF of just my slides. So if anybody wanted that, Tiffany will be responsible for sharing that out. I will pull up the...
Thank you, Michelle. Really, really informative session. You provide with lots of resources and informations. So this is one question I put up on the document. It's talking about the statement you just mentioned about where you could find those references.
What I would have to do is I will have to kind of pull them up and then I will email them to Tiffany. And when Tiffany sends out that the recording is ready to go out, she can send out some of the resources for that as well. Most of them I probably got from the Guarding Minds at Work, though, with the discussion between the links between how those factors and what they cause. Predominantly, most of those references would have come from there.
Yes, awesome. Thank you, Michelle. So Michelle is going to leading one of the interactive activity at the in-person event. Would you like to just talk a little bit about what kind of event activity you're going to doing at the event on this first?
Yeah, so my event is actually, or my activity is going to be looking at lagging versus leading indicators. So lots of times safety goals can be written as workers should report there's an ergonomic concern, right? But then if you look at that statement, like where does the responsibility lie? And then how do you know in a year if the statement actually that the workers reporting ergonomic concerns, how do you know if they're doing it or not? So if you change it from just a lagging indicator, which are things like WCB, time loss rates, injury rates, your incident reports for the last year, none of those will actually tell you what's going to happen in the future. But if you were to take workers should report ergonomic concern and then try to use leading indicator information and make it like a SMART goal, you would say, when a worker reports an ergonomic concern, it will be investigated within 15 business days. And then in a year, you can look at all the ergonomic concerns that were reported and did they meet the target of being investigated in 15 days, yes or no? And then you can actually sort of proactively be able to address it. And that's just one simple one, but that's sort of the concept of it, that you can use like percent of people that have actually got safety training done as a way to sort of measure your safety program from a proactive perspective instead of just reactive.
Awesome. It looks really, really exciting about that day. We are going to hosting up to 5 interactive activity in that in-person event. So if you haven't registered, please go ahead to register. I already put the link on the chat. So just want to ask you any more questions to Michelle, then put it on the chat. That will be before we conclude the session here. Yeah, I'm going to send all the resources and that recorded session link and the slide deck to all of you. You have registered. So no worries, I'll be making sure you're all receiving those information.
Yeah, and like I said, I'll put the links together this afternoon and send it to
Yeah,
Tiffany for end of day. And then when her email goes out, I'll have some references in there for the team to access.
awesome. Great. It looks like doesn't have more question coming up. So thank you, Michelle, again. Thank you for all of you joining this session. So very looking forward to see you all in the in-person event. So and then the next coming up webinar too as well. Thank you. Have yourself a really, really great day. Bye.
Bye.